One day the noise stops making sense. The laughter around you feels rehearsed. The smiles look like masks, and suddenly, what used to feel like belonging feels like sitting in a room full of strangers. That's when it begins. The slow vanishing. Not a dramatic rebellion, not a breakdown, just a quiet refusal to keep pretending. Awake people don't storm out of society. They slip through the cracks, like ghosts who finally realize the party was never real in the first place. The first cracks. They told you this was life. Work hard, smile politely, laugh at the right moments, keep the peace, keep your mask in place. And for a while you believed them. You played along. You clapped when everyone else clapped. You repeated the lines they gave you. I'm fine. Things are good. Yeah, I'm happy. But over time, the cracks began to show. Small at first, barely noticeable. A conversation that left you empty. A celebration that felt staged. A relationship that looked alive in photos but had already died in private. At first, you assumed it was your fault. Maybe you were broken. Maybe you were too sensitive, too cynical, too negative. Because everybody else seemed fine with the script. But the longer you paid attention, the more obvious it became. The laughter came too fast, like it was rehearsed. The co-worker who swore they loved their job confessed in whispers that they hated it. The couple that bragged about being soulmates couldn't stand each other when the cameras were off. The friend who preached self-love crumbled when the likes didn't come. It wasn't just you. The world had become a stage, and the actors didn't even know they were acting anymore. That's when the exhaustion began, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every "how are you" feels like an empty ritual. Every family gathering is another performance of unity. Every meeting is a theater of people pretending to care. And it's not that you hate them. In a way, it's worse. You pity them, you grieve for them, because deep down you know they didn't choose this either. They just got lost in the performance. They forgot what real even looks like. And that's where the internal war begins. Part of you wants to keep playing along. Smile, nod, laugh. It's easier, it's safer. Belonging always feels safer. But another part of you, the part that refuses to die, keeps whispering, this isn't living, it's pretending. That voice won't leave you alone. And the more you hear it, the harder it becomes to keep performing. So you stop. You stop laughing at jokes that aren't funny. You stop clapping for victories that don't matter. You stop repeating lines you don't believe in. And people notice. Suddenly you're too much, too intense, too negative, too hard to be around. But the truth is simpler. When you stop performing, you expose the fact that they're still on stage. Your silence becomes louder than their words, and they resent you for it. That's how the separation begins. The invitations slow down, the conversations shrink, the distance grows. They think you're leaving them, but the truth is they left themselves a long time ago. All you did was finally stop pretending to follow. And that's how it starts. Not with rebellion, not with a dramatic exit, but with one quiet refusal. I won't perform anymore. From that moment on, you're no longer part of the show. You're a ghost in the audience, watching everyone else pretend it's real, and that's when the disappearing begins. The exhaustion. It doesn't collapse all at once. It creeps in quietly, until one day you notice every conversation feels heavier than it should. The laughter around you sounds borrowed, the smiles look strained, and the rooms you walk into feel staged, like you're watching a play you didn't agree to attend. The worst part is you can't stop noticing it. You see the co-worker bragging about how busy they are while wasting hours scrolling in secret. You see the friend who posts about authentic living while lying about every detail of their life. You see the family member warning others about toxic people while being the most toxic person in the room. Once the lens changes, you can't unsee it. At the dinner table, the masks scream louder than the voices. A smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a compliment offered without meaning, Small talk that circles the weather and the weekend because anything deeper feels too dangerous. How was your day? I'm fine. Yeah, me too. Lines exchanged like currency, meant to fill silence but never to reveal truth. And while everyone else keeps performing, you feel your soul leaving the room. At first, you try to stay in the game. You laugh when you're supposed to. You nod at the right places. You play along with the script, hoping it won't drain you so much if you just fake it better. But inside, it's killing you. Because performance costs energy. It costs more than you can afford. Smiling when you don't mean it. Pretending to care when you don't. Acting like surface-level chatter matters when your entire being is starving for depth. That's when the fatigue sets in. Not physical, but spiritual. Your battery drains like a phone with a broken charger. Every interaction pulls more out of you than it gives. Every conversation feels like work. Every relationship feels like theater. And after enough of that, the thought creeps in. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm too critical. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm the one who can't just relax and enjoy life. But then, it happens. One real moment. Just one. A raw, unguarded exchange with someone who's also tired of pretending. A look in their eyes that says, I see it too. And suddenly, the weight shifts. You remember what real connection feels like. You remember you're not crazy, you're not broken, you're not negative. You're just awake. And being awake in a world that survives on performance is the most exhausting thing you'll ever live through. The heartbreak. What nobody warns you about is the grief, because awareness isn't just clarity, it's heartbreak on repeat. You watch people you love destroy themselves with lies and call it happiness. You see the friend who posts anniversary photos with a forced smile while secretly suffocating in their marriage. You see the family member who celebrates promotions but dreads every single day at their job. You see the one who fills their weekends with crowded parties because they can't stand the silence of being alone. On the surface, it all looks fine. But underneath, you feel the collapse, and you can't unfeel it. The cruelty of awakening is that you can see what's wrong, but you can't fix it. You can't unmask people who aren't ready to face themselves. You can't drag someone into depth when they've built their whole identity around the shallow. So you try. You make gentle suggestions. You ask harder questions. You offer honesty instead of polite lies. And almost every time they recoil, they tell you you're negative, that you're overthinking, that you're impossible to be around. They'd rather attack you than face the truth staring back at them. So you stop trying. Not because you don't care, but because caring becomes unbearable when it always turns into rejection. You stop pointing out the obvious. You stop offering suggestions for authenticity. You stop hoping that they'll suddenly drop the act. And that silence breaks your heart too. Because you don't want to give up on them. You don't want to watch them drown in illusions. But you learn the hard way that trying to wake someone who wants to stay asleep is just another form of violence. So you grieve. Not once, but over and over again. You grieve every conversation that could have been real, but wasn't. You grieve every relationship that collapses under the weight of dishonesty. You grieve the communities that gather in the name of love or truth, but really just perform rituals of belonging. The heartbreak doesn't stop, because the illusions don't stop. And slowly you realize the only way to protect yourself is to start pulling back, to take your love and your care and fold them inward before they get shattered again. And that's when the loneliness creeps in. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, the deeper kind. The loneliness of seeing too much, of knowing what's broken and realizing you can't fix it. It's a grief that doesn't end because it's tied to the world itself. And as much as you want to hold on, as much as you want to stay, some part of you knows, if you don't start retreating, your own soul won't survive. The quiet exit. Awake people don't leave with fireworks. They don't storm out or announce a revolution. They disappear quietly, almost invisibly, like smoke slipping through the cracks. At first it looks harmless, a missed dinner, a delayed reply, an excuse about being busy. Nobody notices. Everyone assumes life just got in the way. But the spaces grow wider, the invitations stop being accepted, the group chats go unanswered, and before long, the person who used to be everywhere is suddenly nowhere. There are patterns to it, though. Some choose the silent fade. They don't cut ties, they just stop feeding them. They no longer invest in conversations that feel shallow, and without their effort, the connection starves and dies. Others take the geographic escape. They pack up and move to smaller towns, quieter places, anywhere the performance is thinner. They trade skyscrapers for mountains, cocktail parties for solitude, the stage lights for sunsets. Then there are the ones who retreat into invisibility at work. They abandon jobs that demand fake enthusiasm and meaningless culture. They choose paths where they can work alone, free from the suffocating theatre of team spirit and company values. And some people vanish more dramatically, though even that is done in silence. They retreat into monasteries, retreats, long stretches of solitude where they can finally hear themselves again. Others collapse completely, burning out, breaking down, their system shutting off because the illusion became too heavy to carry. And maybe the most painful of all are the exiles, the ones society itself pushes out, branded as difficult, negative, not a team player, frozen out until they have no choice but to leave. But the wisest among them don't vanish entirely. They go underground. They stop wasting energy on audiences who don't want the truth, and instead they create in the shadows. They write under pseudonyms. They build small circles of people who actually value honesty. They influence from the edges, invisible to the crowd, but vital to those who find them. What all of these exits have in common is that they are quiet. No announcements, no declarations, just a refusal to keep feeding a world built on pretending. And the irony is, their absence is barely noticed at first. A friend assumes they're busy. A colleague assumes they're distracted. A family member assumes they've grown distant. But what's really happening is something much larger. The awake are leaving the stage. They're done with the noise. They're done with the masks. They're done with a society that punishes honesty and rewards performance. And when enough of them vanish, the rest of us are left with the performance turned up louder than ever, desperate to cover the silence they left behind. The cost of losing them. The tragedy isn't just that awake people disappear. The tragedy is what vanishes with them. Because when they go quiet, the world loses its early warning system. These were the ones who noticed the cracks first, the ones who felt the poison in the air long before anyone admitted the room was filling with smoke. They were the canaries in the coal mine, the truth-tellers, the conscience. And when they stop speaking, when they stop showing up, corruption stops being noticed and starts being normalized. Look around and you'll see it. Institutions rot from the inside, but there's nobody left to call it out. Communities gather in the name of love or justice, but they slowly become echo chambers of performance. Relationships look stable on the outside, but hollow out in private. Without the presence of those who refuse to play along, lies grow louder, emptier, and harder to challenge. The absence of the awake is like removing oxygen. You don't notice right away, but eventually you can't breathe. It's not just morality that suffers. Creativity dies too. Awake people are often the innovators, the ones who won't settle for imitation or trend chasing. They create from raw truth. They risk honesty in a culture built on image. And when they withdraw, what's left is sterile. People who know how to copy, but not how to create. People who know how to follow, but not how to lead. Culture becomes flatter, safer, more marketable, and utterly lifeless. And here's the cruelest twist. The very people who once called them negative or too much will one day feel the weight of their absence. They'll wonder why conversations feel emptier, why gatherings feel shallow, why the world itself feels noisier but somehow less alive. But by then, the awake will be gone, building something real in private, where the noise can't reach them. Society doesn't collapse overnight. It decays slowly, rotting from the inside while the surface looks fine. And the disappearance of its most honest people is one of the first and most dangerous signs, because without those who see through the illusion, the rest of us will stay trapped inside it, clapping louder, smiling wider, pretending harder, until we can no longer remember what truth ever felt like. The price of withdrawal. For the ones who walk away, the silence isn't free. It comes with its own sharp edges, because disappearing might protect your soul, but it also costs you pieces of it. The first price is loneliness, not the simple kind of being alone, but the deeper kind, the kind that follows you even in a crowded room. When you've seen through the masks, connection becomes rare. You can't unknow the difference between shallow company and real presence. And once you've tasted truth, the surface isn't enough. The world becomes full of people you can't quite touch, and the isolation cuts deeper than solitude ever could. The second price is identity. For years, maybe decades, you defined yourself through the performance. You were the friend who showed up, the worker who pushed harder, the family member who played their role. When you stop playing, the role collapses, and suddenly the question lingers: who am I without the mask? It's disorienting, even terrifying. To step back from the stage isn't just a rebellion against society, it's a dismantling of yourself, and that leaves scars. Then comes the risk of stagnation. Withdrawal brings clarity, yes, but clarity alone isn't enough to sustain you. Some people retreat so deeply they stop creating, stop engaging, stop living. They trade the noise of performance for the silence of observation, and that silence slowly hardens into bitterness. You can see too much, but you do nothing with it. You carry the truth like a heavy stone instead of a living fire. And yet, what choice do they have? To stay is to betray themselves. To leave is to risk vanishing into loneliness and confusion. It's the ultimate double bind. Stay and suffocate, or go and disappear. This is why awakening is not the blessing people romanticize. It's a curse with a cost. You either pay in exhaustion by staying, or in loneliness by leaving. Either way, the debt is yours. But here's the subtle truth most people miss. The ones who disappear aren't weak. They're not broken. They didn't walk away because they failed. They walked away because they refused to keep paying the higher price, the price of pretending. And while the silence cuts them, while the solitude tests them, it is still more bearable than living a lie every single day. The turning point. Every exile eventually reaches a crossroads. The silence that once felt like safety begins to feel like suffocation. The loneliness becomes unbearable, the identity crisis impossible to ignore. And in that raw space, there's a decision to make. Either remain hidden, fading into the background of life, or reclaim what awakening was always meant to give you: freedom. Not the freedom society promised, not the freedom of applause or belonging, but the freedom to exist without pretending. It starts small, a choice to speak honestly, even if the room falls silent afterward. A refusal to laugh at a joke you don't find funny. A boundary drawn where there used to be none. These aren't rebellions. They're reclamations, pieces of yourself returning one by one. And though they don't erase the loneliness, they change its shape. Because loneliness feels different when it comes from being true to yourself instead of abandoning yourself. From there, the reclamation spreads. You begin to build a life that doesn't need to be performed. Work that doesn't feel like theater. Relationships that don't collapse under silence. Conversations that feed you instead of starve you. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow construction, fragile at first, always threatened by the temptation to slip back into the safety of masks. But every time you choose truth over performance, you take back ground that once belonged to illusion. And with each choice, you become harder to manipulate. The guilt trips bounce off. The passive aggression dissolves. The pressure to perform loses its grip. Because once you've survived the loneliness of walking away, you realize there's nothing left anyone can take from you. You've already lost the belonging you feared losing. You've already felt the heartbreak of being misunderstood. You've already died to the image they wanted you to be. And what's left is something stronger. A self that no longer needs permission to exist. This is the paradox of awakening. At first it breaks you. It strips you of identity, of comfort, of community. It leaves you standing alone in the wreckage of illusions. But if you stay there long enough, if you survive the silence, something else emerges. A clarity that cannot be shaken. A voice that cannot be silenced. A freedom that cannot be traded back for applause. You stopped clapping for the show, yes, but more importantly, you stopped performing in it. And that is where real power begins. The final message. Here's the truth no one wants to admit. Awake people don't disappear because they're weak. They disappear because they're strong enough to stop betraying themselves. They walk away from the performance, even if it costs them everything: status, belonging, even love. And while the world mocks them as broken, bitter, or depressed, they are quietly reclaiming the only thing that ever mattered: their soul. But their absence leaves a mark. When they vanish, the performance gets louder, emptier, more desperate. Politicians shout harder. Influencers post more often. Families double down on appearances. Everyone claps with manic smiles, trying to drown out the silence left behind. Yet if you listen closely, the silence is still there. The empty seats are multiplying, and somewhere deep inside, you feel the pull to join them. That's the choice in front of you. You can keep clapping for the show. You can keep laughing at the jokes you don't find funny. You can keep playing the role society handed you, smiling wide as the mask digs deeper into your skin. Or you can leave, not in anger, not in rebellion, quietly, on your own terms, the way all the awake eventually do. Because disappearing isn't defeat, it's refusal. It's choosing authenticity over applause, peace over performance, truth over belonging. It's not a breakdown, it's an initiation. And once you cross that threshold, there is no going back. So ask yourself, will you keep playing along until the curtain falls on its own? Or will you be one of the few who walks away before the theatre collapses?